board of now. Oh, someone's here. Hold on. Where is it? Got it. Okay. Where's my mouse? Okay. Anyways, so I'm on the board of the International Humanistic Management Association USA chapter. I'm on the board for the Center for Free Thought Equality, and I'm a distinguished honorary professor for the Global Forum for Teacher Educators. And as I said, I've written several books. One of my books is in the Royal Military College of Canada's curriculum for critical thinking and ethics. It's all that same book is in the UUA's curriculum for youth on critical thinking and decision making and ethics. And all of my education that I provide integrates ethics and behavioral science. So basically when people hire me, it's because they want to learn about how to integrate ethics into their work in some way. So let's start with the what. What are ethics? Ethics are defined as moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. Now, synonyms for this might be morals, values, principles, or ideals, and they all get to basically the same idea. The purpose is to determine what is good and what is bad so we can act accordingly and ideally do more good and less harm. Now, everyone has ethical values and principles, even if we don't always live up to our own ideals. Often when we're thinking about ethics, it's because someone around us is behaving in a way that we feel is unethical, and their unethical behavior is negatively impacting us. So a lot of what I get is, how can I fix this other person who's unethical? That's what people hire me to do. And the answer is, I can't really do that, but I can help you deal with an unethical situation in a way that you will feel good about by invoking your own values. Companies often also have value statements. They'll make these things explicit, and companies rarely live up to their ideals either. If you've ever looked at Glassdoor, you'll see a lot of people complaining that the values of the company were not met by their real life experience with their line manager. So this is kind of the paradox of being human, right? Is we care passionately about ethics because unethical people hurt us, but we're not so good about looking at our own behavior, and we're also really bad about talking about ethics. And we often let our ethics slide because we're not willing to really have a conversation with our coworkers about, you know, what the ethical thing to do is. So if you're in a workplace, think about yourself. How often have you interjected into a strategy meeting, well, what is the ethical thing to do here? Right? People don't like to ask that question because they worry that it's going to infringe on someone's right to even bring up the question. Because in America, one of our core values is freedom of religion or belief. And so we know it's okay for people to think differently than us, but that also leads us to not necessarily want to talk about ethics more explicitly. But with ethics, what is good and what is bad is central. And ideally, we do want other people to act morally because it impacts us. But morality is being moral and ethical is actually pretty hard to do, especially in a group. The first question you should be asking is like, well, what ethical values should we be using, right? If you're going to do this in a group, you have to have some consensus on what those values are. Different people of different faith and cultural backgrounds might value different things, and that's okay. Like I said, freedom of belief is central to all that we do. The second problem is, even if you agree on a specific value, say everyone in your group says, yeah, compassion is good, let's do that. Deciding how to invoke compassion and what the compassionate response is almost never straightforward. So people often give up and don't talk about it. It's not that we don't have values, we do, but we can't figure out what the moral thing to do is, so we kind of just give up. And that happens even when people share values. It's harder when they don't even share values. And this is why I think ethics, so many people eliminate ethics from their learning programs instead of making them central, because of all the problems that come with trying to figure out this minefield that might be ethics, right? But if we don't have some idea of what is good and what is bad, then what are we teaching, right? Like, even if you're training people on food safety in a restaurant, right, there's a moral component to that. If people don't take food safety seriously, right, people could die. That's bad. There's an ethical reason you're doing the trainings you're doing. And so making that ethics a bit more explicit, I think, helps with the training. I know with the trainings that I do, the people that are on my trainings are usually become engaged as the training goes along, because they really want this, including the people, like I have people that come to some of my online courses that have been ordered to take one of my courses by a judge, right? So they're reluctant to be there, and they come back to me and say, this should be mandatory training everywhere, right? And because I'm helping them understand their own ethics, I'm not imposing my ethics on them, but I'm helping them define their own ethics so that they can do that. But part of it is, even if you can agree, right, what is the right thing to do? And that's kind of the trolley question. What is the right thing to do? Is it okay to kill one person to save a bunch of people? Ethics is rarely about what is good and bad. It's often, what's the lesser of two evils? And no one likes having that conversation. So ethics are complicated. They're just very, very complicated. And I think acknowledging that helps to have the conversations that we need to have to figure it out as a group. So the why integrate ethics? And the answer for me is that all problem solving is ethical. Like, if you don't have a sense of what a good solution is, and good is a moral term, then what are you doing? Like, how do you even decide how to solve your problem if you don't have an ethical metric about what constitutes a good solution? So why integrate ethics into your learning solution? And the answer for me, in my experience, is that doing so is going to help your learners become more engaged with the training. It will help them retain what they learn better, because it's going to matter to them. The solutions you're helping them learn will matter to them, because they will understand why this matters from an ethical standpoint, why learning this matters, not just to the organization, but to them as individuals. All businesses, all good businesses, solve real problems that really matter to real people. And if you keep that in mind, why these solutions matter, it's going to come back to ethics, right? And let's go back to my example of teaching food safety in a restaurant. Why are we doing this? So we don't kill people, right? It's not just that we have to do this to, comply with the requirements of our county's food safety and health department. We're doing this because we don't want our customers to die from food poisoning, right? So that's a very simple, easy example of kind of, if you ask yourself these why questions, why are we doing this? Why this solution and not another one? You'll often find yourself with an ethical grounding to it that you can then insert into the learning solution. So the next question is how do we make this happen? And the first item on my list is to make a list of ethical values. If you're going to integrate ethics into a learning solution or a training, you first have to decide which ethical values you're going to invoke and be explicit about that. Now, if the company has a list of ethical values, then by all means, use that list. If they don't, then, and you're creating a more generic training solution that's not just for a single company, but for several, you might still take that list and just not attribute it to the company and just leave the list as it is with no attribution at all. There's several places where you can find values lists. One of the values of a humanist list is that they're common human values, right? Things like being honest, being compassionate, being responsible. These are things that are pretty universal, regardless of background, where people live in the world, what their religious beliefs are. If I talk to people about compassion, the majority of people understand what that is and why it matters. If I talk to people about being honest, they understand what that is, and it's kind of universal. So whatever the list is, make sure it's a universal list and not specific to a religion or a culture. The second thing you need to do is define those values. Like, what do you mean by compassion? What do you mean by honesty? What do you mean by responsibility? What do you mean by diversity? What do you mean by inclusion? You know, what are the terms you're going to use? You need to define them in a way that people can feel and understand from wherever their starting point is. And you won't know necessarily what that is. So, and this is kind of where I use the Socratic method. I start asking myself questions. What do I mean by honesty? How does honesty manifest in the solution? What happens if people aren't honest? Why does honesty matter in the context of the problem being solved by the training? I just ask myself a bunch of questions about why and what, and I end up with the answers I need to then share that with my students. And again, that's kind of the value of the Socratic method. The Socratic method is why Socrates taught this. It's why he taught through asking questions, is because if I was to consult with you on your learning solution and you told me, well, we want to make, name the value integrated with the training, I would start asking, I would go Socratic on you. I would start asking you why. What do you mean by that term? And what happens if people aren't doing this value, aren't exhibiting this value? Like if it's inclusion, what happens when people aren't included? What is the bad thing that happens, right? Why does this matter so much? And that is very, very useful, not only to interrogate yourself, but as a teaching tool. Instead of like dictating to people what the values are, you can ask Socratic questions about the values and help your students explore their own values in the context of their own work, right? So if you're in a manufacturing floor and there's something going on, well, how does honesty impact their interpersonal relations? What happens if their colleagues are not honest with them about delivery times, right? What happens if someone lies about a problem? It goes unsolved, right? So, you can ask these questions in the context of a training and have people really kind of understand on a personal level how it impacts them so that they understand. The final method, I think, that's really, really helpful is case studies and stories. How do ethics impact things in real life? Can we activate people's emotions so that they feel the value personally? And I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. Our ethical values, all human values, are very strongly tied to our emotional life. Things that are good help us, things that are bad hurt us, right? And this can be very, very primal. So understanding that if you want people to really get the ethical value as part of the training, that telling a story and helping them feel the impact of both the absence of that value, but also the presence of that value in the activity and the actions that take place will help them really get and engage on that value. So when I talk about invoking a value, this is kind of what I'm talking about, is how do I invoke the value in a way that helps people feel the good and the bad that might be attached to that value in terms of its presence or its absence. So let me give you an example. I use compassion a lot in my trainings. It's one of the core values that I invoke in my trainings. It's also a core value of the humanist philosophy that I teach. And one of the main challenges of being actively compassionate, and the main pushback I get when I tell people, you know, you should try compassion, is how to be compassionate when you're frustrated by the activities and actions of other people, right? Why should we be compassionate with people who are actively hurting us or inconveniencing us or whatever? So, so this is an actual slide I use when I'm doing trainings on compassion to help people feel it for themselves. So imagine this is Christmas time or the holidays, and you're out shopping for presents, and you walk into a store and this is what you encounter. Do you respond to this situation with frustration or with compassion? And most of us are going to say, realistically, the frustration, right? This is just a horrifying situation to be in for everybody. But if you manage to recognize your frustration and fear that might come with this scene of shoppers, and reminded yourself to switch from frustration and fear and anger to compassion for yourself, compassion for the clerks, and compassion for the other shoppers that might not be behaving at their best because it's the holidays and they're stressed out, right? So which one of these responses, the compassion for yourself and the clerks and the shoppers, or frustration, which one of those feels better? Like, I know I'd rather be the happy woman and not the frustrated, angry woman, right? Just as at a gut level, I'd love to be able to go in to a frustrating situation and respond, you know, with grace and compassion, right? But the real question is, which one of these responses makes you feel like you're being a good human being, like you're nailing the whole ethical human being thing? It's obviously compassion. Right? If we respond with frustration, we're just adding to the frustration. We're not helping anything. But if we respond with compassion and calm, then we are actually helping the clerks and other people that might come in contact with us. And that matters. This example, when I do this, I'll have people come back to me a couple of weeks later and tell me that everything's different now, right? Because they want this and they start actively practicing it. And as they actively practice it, they start reaping the benefits from it immediately. But what this kind of example does is I'm encouraging my audience to feel it for themselves, to think about how they themselves interact with the emotions that are at the core of the value compassion. It's not an abstract. I'm not talking about it in abstract terms. This is a real situation that most adults have encountered and dealt with, and didn't respond as well as they'd like, and they know it, right? So that's one of the values of storytelling and whatnot, and using these case studies, things like that, as a way to invoke the emotion. So if you don't have a list of values for your company, And one of the challenges is if you do have a list of values for the company and you start invoking them in the training, the most likely response is going to be, people are going to say, yeah, but they just say that. In reality, I've experienced violations of these values in my life. And I would say use that as a teaching moment and say, yeah, we know that's why we're doing this training. And we want your help to make it better. Like, shouldn't we be trying to live up to our values, right? That's the danger of invoking values in a training. But where do you get your list from? One of the lists I really like is the 10 humanist commitments from the American Humanist Association. I've got a link there and you can see the wheel. You can see part of the wheel anyways. And you see that there's top level words: responsibility, empathy, critical thinking, global awareness, environmentalism, humility, altruism, and things like that, plus little descriptions of it. They have published this in, I think, 10 different languages. There's longer descriptions for each of these values that can be used. The man I'm interviewing tomorrow, Joe Sprangle, who's doing, he's going to be talking to the International Humanistic Management Association on humanistic manufacturing. He uses this wheel as the centerpiece of his book on humanistic manufacturing. So, you know, and you can just take one or two of these. I'm a big fan of the rule of threes, and I tend to focus on 3 values in my training so that I don't overwhelm people. So what is the most applicable value to the learning solution that you're putting together? My core trinity is compassion, responsibility, and honesty. Those are the ones I keep coming back to. The International Humanistic Management Association has dignity, well-being, flourishing, and collaboration as their values. It doesn't really matter what the value list is, as long as you're clear about what they are and what you mean by those terms. So let's talk about some of the techniques on how to actually do this. And I had mentioned Socratic questioning before. For me, the core value of this technique is critical thinking. The goal of using this technique is to encourage people to think for themselves. Basically, you're going to start asking questions about what is good and what is bad and encourage discussions. I like to think of the Socratic method as kind of a U-shaped journey. And you're going to ask questions until you get to the core values, and a core value is what happens if this value isn't there, and it's usually something bad, possibly people dying. And then you build back up a solution that integrates that value. Now that they understand why that value is important, you can start building back up to a solution. The key is to don't lead the people through the questioning. Let them think through the problem for themselves and let them define good for themselves. And yes, this method works great to win arguments without arguing, but that's not actually what you do when you do this. When you use the Socratic method in an argument, you're actually trying to find out what the other person thinks for real and why they think it and what underpins that. Usually what I find when I'm having a conversation with someone I don't agree with and I start asking the questions is that I find that we do in fact agree on core values. We do in fact agree on what a good outcome will be. We just have disagreements on how to create that good outcome. And that's, in a workplace, valuable knowledge. Once you can have agreement on not only what is good and bad and what a good solution is, then you can start collaborating to build that and integrating parts of what makes sense for both people into that solution. And we'll take questions at the end. The next technique that I use is I actively encourage compassion, not just in the Socratic process of conversations, but also to help people see past the I, me, my into a collaboration. So the core value of encouraging compassion is both compassion and dignity, dignity for self, dignity for the other person. And the goal is individual growth and learning. I do a lot of training on how to stop bullying and harassment using behavioral science. And part of what is required to do the techniques that science says works to get bullying to stop actually require compassion to implement. And so people come to me, how do I fix this other person? And the answer is actually by fixing yourself a bit first, not that you're doing anything wrong, but reframing how you're viewing the entire situation through a lens of compassion for yourself first and compassion for the other person changes how you approach the problem so that you're more effective at solving it. To do this, you need to model dignity, and you model dignity by giving dignity. If you're not giving dignity to people, you're not behaving with dignity. The second thing you're doing is advocating concern for the well-being of others. For yourself, don't not include yourself, you matter, but also for the other person and for the world at large and everybody in it. Make it okay to disagree, and that, you know, people do have valid disagreements on things. It's absolutely okay. You might not at the end of this have an agreement on the best way to move forward, but you may very well have planted some seeds that will yield flowers later on. Not everything has to be a battle that's won. And I think that's a mistake people make. And by kind of switching your mindset to, okay, I'm going to approach this with compassion for myself and acknowledge the frustration I'm feeling, but also that the other person is probably also feeling these things as well. And I'm going to behave with dignity by giving this person dignity, even if I don't think they deserve it. And that can change everything. It really can. There's more to it than that. But, you know, for the purpose of this, if you're bringing up ethics into a learning solution, people can get very emotional about it. Most people have experienced what Donna Hicks, who does peace, she literally negotiates peace treaties between people who are at war. And she says the first thing that has to happen is people have to have their dignity violations acknowledged. Right. And so everybody you know has been traumatized in some way. They've been hurt in some way. No one gets through life unscathed. And part of the concern of well-being for others and part of the dignity practice and the compassion is to recognize your own trauma, but also to recognize that the person you're dealing with also has trauma. So if you're in a teaching situation or a training situation and you're invoking ethics, expect people to come up with the trauma of whatever this ethical value is you just invoked. They're going to have stories about how they were mistreated on this value, how their dignity was violated because someone didn't adhere to this value. And that's actually a really great, it's sometimes very, very difficult as a trainer to listen to some of these stories. But it also means that this person is engaged with the value, they're feeling it, and that's what we want. And so giving them the dignity and modeling dignity and concern for well-being is what gets everybody through that. And, you know, just be prepared for that. But compassion will get you through that part of it. A word about witnessing. The core value here is freedom of belief. The goal is to share and invite comparison. So there's a difference between witnessing and proselytizing. And a friend of mine, my old Tai Chi instructor, who's Christian, and he teaches Tai Chi to teach Christianity. He told me about my humanist practice, that what he liked about it is that I witness, I don't proselytize. And that was weird for me because I'm not a religious person. But he basically said that witnessing is perfectly okay. I'm telling you, this is how I think. This is how I do it, right? You can choose differently. It's completely fine. But the act of me explaining how I do it invites that comparison while giving space to people to choose differently. And that is key. Proselytizing is, this is how you should think or do things. And everyone responds badly to this. If I came in and said, this is how you have to do it, there's only one way to teach ethics, right? You have to do it my way. You all would be, oh my gosh, this woman does not know the first thing about ethics, right? Because I just violated your freedom of belief, which is a core value you probably hold, right? But by saying, okay, you know, I acknowledge that everybody is different from me, but this is how I solve the problems that I've encountered. This is how I've dealt with grief. This is how I deal with dealing with difficult people. This is what works for me, and why it works for me. And there's some science behind that. Now I've got you engaged, and it's a lot easier for people to have those conversations because I've made space for it. So in every single book I've written, when I'm explicit about the humanism, the humanist values, which is where I'm coming from, I'm very clear. It's okay if you disagree with me. That's like the first thing I say in all of my books. It's okay for you to disagree with me. My job is to explain to you how I do it. And you can take from that what works for you and ignore the stuff that you really don't like. It's absolutely okay. And that's the difference between witnessing and proselytizing. So when you're talking about ethics and you're invoking ethics at all, you have to make space for people to not like that ethic. There are some people who just hate the idea of compassion. They just hate it. And that seems like really weird to me, but it's like I've experienced it and it's okay. And so, well, what do they value? Like, so that's when I start going Socratic and I find what do they value and why do they feel that way? And find a way for them to interact with the material in a way that makes sense to them. I once did a 6-week training on the humanist approach to happiness for a college. And one of the guys in my class, everything, he could not really relate to anything unless he contextualized it in the Palestinian situation in Israel. And so I just helped him when I would introduce something and he came back at me with this, I help him contextualize whatever the value was or whatever the practice was I was teaching in a way that he understood it, because it's not about me. It's about him learning what he needs to learn so that he can go forward and use the material however he wants to use it. Like all I can do is plant the seed, right? So the question I get when I teach teachers this, whether it's for the Global Forum or, and I included a link to the International Humanistic Management Association. We have a whole series on teaching teachers to teach values. 7 different instructors came in to do that for us. But the question I get is, well, how do I integrate ethics into, say, a chemistry class? Right? Does this work for any topic? And the answer is yes. And you know, the way to figure it out is to ask yourself Socratic questions. Why were these things researched in the first place? Who researched them? What problems were they trying to solve in researching whatever this is? What knowledge was found? How are we using this information to improve people's lives? You know, and that gets you 3 really important things, which is history, knowledge, and the values, compassion, and responsibility. Why does this information matter? How is it being used to improve people's lives? Is it being used to improve people's lives? It could be being used to hurt people. But the result of doing this kind of Socratic work to identify what the values are results in deep learning for the students. They will become way more engaged if you're doing this. So any questions or thoughts? Hello.
I'm just going to say that is extremely interesting in that way of presenting it. I've actually studied a lot of these concepts in, I guess, a little bit of a different way. I've read a lot of different books, and I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how you're teaching this to teachers and what teachers you're teaching to, and how this information is getting around. And I'm actually excited that it is, because I feel that our society is kind of going toward a dark direction. And so,
Right. And it doesn't matter what quote unquote side you're on. Everybody thinks that, right?
yes,
Everybody thinks that. And if you have conversations, you'll see that there's fears that are tied to emotions that are tied to core values, right? And it's the core values that we have that are actually shared, that underlie all these disagreements that are at a higher level. So the Global Forum for Teacher Educators is a nonprofit run by Munir Musa. He's a Pakistani man. He's created curricula that is grounded in human dignity and human rights for teaching kids in Pakistan. And then he kind of created these forums to help people learn it. When he does sessions, there's like 7,000 people on his calls. It's massive. And they're from 65 different countries that show up to these things. And he usually brings me in to teach people how to to integrate the ethics, because human dignity and human rights require this acknowledgement of the reality of the other human that you're interacting with. The compassion is what helps you recognize the person as human, and fully worthy of dignity, having dignity and worth just by value of being alive, right? So, and people struggle with this. You know, they want it. Everybody wants it, but no one knows how to do it. And really, you know, the key is just to invoke the value, right? Not to tie the value to any belief system, right? The audience will, if I'm talking to a Christian, I'm talking about compassion, they will insert it for themselves in their belief system. I don't need to do that work for them. They will do it for themselves. If they're Muslim, I can do the same thing. I talk about compassion, they will put it into their belief system. If I'm talking to an atheist, they will put it in their belief system. All I have to do is invoke the value and talk about, and then insert it into the problem that we're solving via the training, right? So whatever this training is, you know, like give me an example. Why are we doing sexual harassment training, right? Because harassment hurts people, right? And so when I do harassment training, even when I'm doing sexual harassment training, I'm usually talking more about the harassment and how to make harassment stop. And I'm helping people, even people who are ordered by a judge as found guilty of being harassment, they come to my courses and they like it because I'm helping them understand their own reaction, because they believe they're the victims, and they might very well be, right? It's not my place to judge the people who are ordered to come to my training, right? I treat them with dignity, and I assume that they feel hurt because everybody has dignity, has experienced dignity violations, right? And so if I can help people be a better person in response to their own hurt and not necessarily act on that hurt, I can have a tremendous benefit to them and to the organization that they're embedded in, right? And everybody ends up benefiting from that. So, but the key is to just invoke the value and then talk about how that value interacts and is critical to the solution itself. You notice when I talked about the behavior, right? I said you can't stop bullying and harassment without invoking compassion. And the science actually does back that up, right? But it's part of it. I can't separate it because it's necessary to do the behavioral skills that are required to fix the problem of bullying and harassment.
Do you have any kind of solution with regard to sociopathic people?
No. Because sociopathy is a brain, it's physical in the brain, right? And what's happening is that the compassion centers and the empathy centers are not lighting up. So most people, and A. Adams has her hand up. I don't know if that was up earlier, but you're next. Okay. But because compassion is not being activated, there's just, you cannot fix, like you can't teach a butterfly to swim, right? It's just, you have to accept the reality of the individual for who they are. And can you work around it or not? You know, psychopaths are really great at strategy. Can you use that or not? I don't know. You know, often they have to go though, you know, otherwise they could terrorize people, but can you isolate them so that you can get the benefit of them without having them hurt other people? That's a conversation for the organization. But also I wouldn't rush to label people psychopaths, because if you're not a psychologist and you're not the brain scientist working with this person, then you're not qualified to make that determination that that's the problem. I get called in all the time when there's a quote unquote problem person that the organization wants me to fix. And often what I find is that the problem person is a lovely person and that everybody's decided that they're a problem person. And so they really are, they're responding to the negativity that's being directed at them. And they're not behaving well because they're under stress because everybody's treating them like they're an ogre, right? So not jumping to conclusions and treating everyone, including the quote unquote problem person with dignity, is key to figuring out what's going on. And I have a lot more on that in my training programs, that like when you do this process, the real problem will surface as a result of it without you having to assume that any individual is a problem. I hope that helps. So, Ms. Adams?
Yeah, actually, my question kind of goes along with that. Not so much psychopath, but I get that part of it. It's just, I've worked with a lot of teachers and CEOs. It's my company, it's my classroom. So they're not extending the dignity to the students in the classroom, you know, because they make the rules, it's their classroom. How do you deal with that? And how do you, like, what value and shift needs to happen there? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you know,
Okay.
I would like the humanist in me starts viewing them as the person making that statement. I would go Socratic on them, and I would not to change them, but to find out what the underlying hurt is and the dignity violation that they experience that is causing them to take that approach, right? And how can you help them fix the underlying problem that they think they have while doing and being better at the same time, right? That's where the gold is in a learning solution, is meeting the person where they are and what they need to learn and helping them understand why they will want to learn this. And when you can do that, but to do that, you have to understand what's driving them. And that requires treating them with dignity and compassion so that you can get those answers, so that you can then embed them. And I assure you, if you can get them, other people are having the same problem, but they're not necessarily as open as this one person.
Because people don't like to lose control, you know, so there's a
right. And you know, who knows what, you don't know what they experienced
until
in their
you
lives.
ask. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, but figuring that out and finding what the underlying value is that they feel was violated at some point in their past, that the control in the classroom is vital to them protecting, will help. And then the rest of it is like teaching them what works to fix the problem they think they have, right? And obviously control causes all sorts of other problems in a classroom, right? So they're causing other problems to prevent a problem.
Yeah.
So
I had another question.
okay.
Do you find that people often confuse ethics with annoyances? Like, that just really bugs me when they do that. And how do you explain that difference?
So a lot of times when people are talking about ethics, they're doing it to complain about other people they don't think are ethical.
Yeah.
Right. That they're not thinking about their own behavior. All they know is this other person's bad because this other person's negatively impacting them. Right. And that's perfectly fine. That's their starting place. That's the starting place for 90% of humanity, right? There's a reason why the great ethical teachers, all backgrounds, all the major faiths, all the major philosophers talked about compassion. And the reason for it is everybody has these, you know, they're not the problem, the other person's the problem. And as my mom said, it takes two people to fight. I'm part of the, like I'm in conflict with someone, I'm part of the problem, right? So a lot of what I teach, like Socratic Jiu-Jitsu, I had that slide up, right? That course is marketed as how do you win arguments without arguing, which everybody wants to learn because they want to win the argument, right? But the reality is that I'm not teaching you how to win an argument. I'm actually teaching you how to not care if you win the argument by completely changing your mindset to be one of Socratic inquiry, like become curious about this other person, right? And the first people that took that course were like, I didn't know I needed to learn this. Like you gave me what I needed, but you marketed me what I wanted, but you gave me what I needed, right? I didn't teach them how to win arguments. I taught them how to not care about winning arguments. And paradoxically, when you don't care if you win the argument, you almost always end up winning the argument by virtue of not caring and actually trying to find a solution, right? You can't, and it's not something you can fake. So, yeah. Does anybody else, and did everybody get the link to the Humanistic Management International, teaching teachers to teach values? Like I said, there's 7 videos there that we did a couple of summers ago with educators from all over the world on how they integrate ethics into their classroom. And everybody but me is a college professor in a business school, right? So this is all that's what the International Humanistic Management largely is how do we change the business schools to teach humanistic management? And so we had people from the Philippines talking about it and so forth. So you know, if you're curious on how to do this, there's no one right way to do it. I just told you my way. I witnessed for my way, right? But there's other ways to do it and they're all valid and they all work. So
I'll make sure that link gets posted on our site.
perfect. And it's all free. I mean, all the videos we put up are free. So any other questions? I see. All right. Anybody who hasn't asked yet, and then we'll go back to them. Speak
Amy?
now. Okay, so Michelle.
I just wanted to ask a quick question because you had mentioned a gentleman's name started with a G and I was wanting to write that down. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Was it Joe Sprangel for the humanistic manufacturing presentation or?
No, it was when I had asked you the first question,
Oh, the Global Forum for Teachers Educators? No.
I thought that was a gentleman's name
Munir
that you had mentioned. Maybe not. Okay, maybe it's just my.
What was it in connection with? That'll help me figure out.
I had asked you about the teaching part of it, and
oh, it was the man's name is Munir Musa. His nonprofit is the Global Forum for Teacher Educators, and
okay.
it's grown to like 8,000 to 10,000 educators in 65 countries. It's impressive on what he's done.
Okay, I guess that was it then. Thank you.
Yeah. Your turn, Miss Adams.
I
I don't know what A stands for, so I'm gonna say
Amy. Sorry. I hate putting Amy Adams because of that actress. Because then I always get that. So we have at my organization an employee resource group, so that they've all come together for about a year now or so. They meet once a month. It's voluntary, whoever wants to come in. Whenever I sit in on it or I've attended, and I loved that. I never knew there was a phrase for it. They have to tell their stories of dignity violation, right? So everybody is telling their stories and just kind of getting it out, and they have been for a while. Like, when is it time to like move past?
So what management should be doing is taking those dignity violations seriously, right?
Their dignity violations, not at work.
Oh, not at work.
Just in their life that they've experienced, like, you know, it could be anything. So it's just people expressing whenever
So it's like a self-help group.
Yeah, it's an employee resource group, but that's like a self-help group. Yeah. And it
So how
very
do
much
people get
feels
help
like
for-
group therapy, and people are all telling their stories.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the purpose of it is. If
Yeah.
the purpose is to get these people resources so that they can fix whatever the problem is, whether it's, a child with difficulties or whatever, I guess it depends on what the company can provide in terms of resources.
Mhm.
People generally, people fall into different categories in terms of how they deal with these things. And it can take a while for people to move from griping off to solutions. And some people don't want the solutions, they just want to gripe. And, creating space for that is valuable, because it's a necessary step. But I would say that maybe having a conversation with a therapist about how to help these people would be appropriate. I'm not a psychologist. I just know that there's people who do grief counseling that do a really good job of helping people process whatever it is, or, point them to the appropriate resource that they need.
At
So,
this point, I think it was just, they started it for awareness and so that everyone could share and see, like, we all have dignity violations and we all, and what someone else is going through, you might not have realized. So
Right.
it was kind of a sharing of stories, but I attended a year later. I'm like, okay, we're still kind
we're
of
still in the same place. It's
Yeah.
possible that taking an appreciative inquiry approach might be useful,
Mm.
right? To help people move out of problems into, well, what are the strengths and what can we fix using the strengths that we have, right? And kind of flipping the narrative from this is a place for me to gripe into a collaborative problem solving forum. But to do that would require like an appreciative inquiry. And they call it David Cooper, is that his name? David Cooper that does the appreciative inquiry work. I went through a session with him and it was fascinating. They call it a U curve, where you start with identifying things and then you identify your strengths and then you work up towards, collaborative solutions. But that sort of framework and bringing someone in with experience in that might be a really powerful way to harness the energy that you're already getting in the group into a more productive and proactive outlet.
Yeah, they've started having some guest speakers here and there. So what was this person's name again, or can we write it in the chat?
If you just type in appreciative inquiry,
Oh, it'll come up. Okay,
it'll come.
thank you.
Yeah, David Cooper, there's actually, groups can go through his sessions. I don't think there's any charge for them, but there's consultants in Tampa that are trained in appreciative inquiry.
Okay. Thank
so,
you. That's good. Good
Yeah.
resource.
So anybody else?
I have a question.
Sure.
What are some key components to include in your storytelling to invoke values?
Well, I think it depends on what the value is. I always try to have a story that people can see themselves in, even if it's a story about me or it's a story I know of someone whose names I'm not going to include. I try to make the story relatable so that it's something that everybody or most everybody will have an experience with, right? So that they can feel it for themselves. And that's the point of the storytelling, right? It's not just a case study. Right? A story is about humans and I'm a human, right? And so can I see myself in the story? And some people have a real problem with it. There's, people need to see specifically people like them in the story to be able to relate to it. Thank you, Michelle. But that's what you're trying to do, is help them see themselves in the story and help them have an emotional response tied to the value that you're invoking. So whatever that value is, how can they feel it? How can they feel the impact of what happens when it's done right and what happens when it's not done right? Right? Because every value has its two sides. It's got the side that causes a dignity violation and the side that creates flourishing, right? So the good and the bad, but that's what you're trying to do with the story.
Great, thanks.
No problem. Michelle Beckert? I see you.
I put in the chat the link to David Cooperrider, and I'll add that to the website as well. So there'll be 2 links and then the recording.
Right. And I like the people at IMA, the International Humanistic Management Association, we went through the process. It was it was really enlivening. It was really great. Anyways, Michelle, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I didn't have any questions. I was just listening intently. I didn't realize I had turned my camera back on.
Oh, that's okay. All right. So any other questions or no? Anybody need anything from me? Happy to help with anything. Otherwise, we're good. Ooh, exactly an hour too.
Yeah, that was great.
That's perfect.
Yeah, thank you for joining us this evening and being so flexible.
Yes.
Not a problem.
Yes. Cool. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Jennifer. I greatly appreciate you being a speaker for us again. Yay. I feel like this is a neglected area across the board, right? So it's good to be reminded of it.
Yeah, I think people are just afraid to bring it in because they don't want the blowback, and what they're worried about is the violation of people's freedom of belief.
Right.
Right. And the reality is what they should be worried about is the blowback that comes in the form of what Ms. Adams was talking about, which is all these dignity violations coming to the surface.
Right.
Because that's actually what happens whenever you invoke the values. So.
Right. Right. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and look for some updates on the website in the next couple of days. I have a very long to-do list of things to update. That gets longer as I, with every heartbeat, I swear to God, they just had more things. So look for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.